The city's most ruthless mafia boss begged me on his knees, and I laughed. I spent 7 years managing crisis and bloodshed to build Victor Hale's underground empire. My reward? He dumped me for a younger woman right in the middle of our anniversary dinner. He offered me $5 million to walk away and keep my mouth shut about his illegal operations. 3 months later, his new life was imploding, and he came crawling back to the woman he threw away. But he had no idea I'd already moved on, and I was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. Let us open the files on Victor Hale and Elena. For 7 years, she operated under the delusion of a hostage, confusing proximity with partnership, a textbook representation of Stockholm Syndrome. She helped this megalomaniac construct his empire, believing an anniversary dinner would validate her worth. Instead, he amputated her with a single cold sentence. I want a divorce. I've already chosen someone else. What we see here is the narcissist's fatal flaw, underestimating the psychological snap of a discarded subject. You and I are going to unpack this clinical descent together. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments. And hit like if you are ready to examine the anatomy of betrayal. We begin the observation in their penthouse, a gilded cage built on illicit capital. Elena engaged in what we call nesting behavior, a desperate trauma response to manufacture stability. She arranged golden candles along marble counters and then set the imported Italian walnut table with the wedding china they had barely touched. The catered food from his preferred restaurant sat beneath silver domes. She stood before the glass, evaluating her midnight blue dress. It was an elegant fitted garment, but in clinical terms, this was not a woman preparing for a romantic evening. This was a subordinate donning a uniform, frantically trying to appease an apex predator whose gaze she had already lost. Notice the hair. She allowed it to fall freely, rebelling against Victor's strict mandate for severe, pinned-back styles. 7 years in this psychological terrarium felt like an entire human lifespan to her. Her mind constantly regressed to their origins in a decrepit South Detroit apartment, smelling of radiator rust. Back then, Victor would return at 3 in the morning with bloody knuckles and untreated antisocial traits. She misread his parasitical need for her as genuine love. They had constructed this syndicate together. Now, they resided 40 floors above the concrete, isolated in wealth. The lesson here is simple. Shared trauma does not forge a healthy bond. It only binds the victim tighter to the executioner. Emotional deprivation is the narcissist's most effective tool of control. Elena could not recall the last time Victor made authentic eye contact with her. By 8:15, his absence was a familiar symptom. Operating an underground syndicate requires pathological detachment, and lateness was simply his baseline. She poured an expensive vintage wine, a prop he hoarded but never consumed, and waited on the sofa. Outside, the city sprawling below was merely a chessboard for his impulses. She used to be his co-conspirator, fully integrated into his violent manic episodes. Now, she was compartmentalized. He fed her redacted summaries, starving her of the very danger that originally cemented her psychological dependence. The digital leash vibrated. A text promised his arrival. On my way, 20 minutes. Her instinct was to send a heart, but she deleted it, choosing a neutral thumbs up instead. This is self-censorship, a survival technique used to avoid triggering the abuser's disgust. 40 minutes bled past, yet she remained entirely static. When the private elevator finally chimed, she forced her facial muscles into an artificial expression of warmth. Victor stepped into the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit. Even as a detached observer, One must acknowledge intimidate physical presence he weaponized. He carried the massive psychological weight of his enterprise. I lie like armor, entirely severed from normal human empathy. At 42, Victor retained the sharp predatory aesthetics of a much younger man. His cold grey eyes operated entirely devoid of warmth, silencing rooms through sheer conditioned fear. When he finally noticed her, Elena offered a tentative greeting. "Hey," she said. "Happy anniversary. I want you to pay close attention here." A micro-expression flickered across his face before his sociopathic defenses erased it. "I made dinner," she told him. "Marchettis, your favorite." But Victor completely bypassed her for the bar, consuming a massive dose of scotch. He looked at her not with affection, but with the dead eyes of a mortician. "You didn't have to do all this," he told her. His gaze was a pure clinical assessment. "Sit down, Elena," he ordered, and the psychological fracture inside her expanded. She noted the food was growing cold, clinging to domestic normalcy, but his command was absolute. "Sit down," he repeated. She perched on the very edge of the couch, folding her hands in the exact posture of a reprimanded child. This physical regression is fascinating to observe. Victor remained at the bar, using the silence as an interrogator uses a spotlight. "I've been thinking about us," hasted. "About where we are, where we've been. 7 years is a long time." Her agreement was desperate, but his questioning of that fact struck like blunt force trauma. His facial muscles were locked in absolute rigidity, a hallmark of the megalomaniac preparing to discard a useless object. "Victor, what are you saying?" she pleaded. He placed his glass down with an agonizingly deliberate click. "I want a divorce. In trauma psychology, we call the resulting sensation dissociation. The physical environment remained stable, but her internal cognitive map disintegrated. Her respiratory system stalled as she whispered, 'What?' Victor delivered the destruction of her reality in a flat, transactional monotone. "I've thought about this for a while. We're not happy. Haven't been for years. You know that." He was dissecting their marriage with a complete emotional void. Her panic response flooded her bloodstream with adrenaline. "Oh, is this all?" she stammered. He calmly examined his liquor. "It's coming from the truth?" He acknowledged their early empire building, only to invalidate it by claiming people simply change. "So, we work on it," she begged, her voice fracturing. "We figure it out. We don't just..." That is when he deployed the lethal strike. "There's someone else." The vestibular illusion of the room tilling is a common symptom of profound shock. "You're having an affair?" she whispered. "I wouldn't call it that," he replied, relabeling it as moving forward. "Her name is Arena." The timeline was calculated to inflict maximum damage. "I met her 4 months ago," he confessed. "She's different, younger. She doesn't carry all this history." Elena pressed her violently, trembling hands hard against legs, utilizing a grounding technique to keep her psyche from shattering. She confronted the cruelty of his timing. Let us look closely at his reaction. A brief shadow of discomfort appeared. "The date wasn't intentional, but I'm not going to lie to you, Elena. I want out." Then, in a classic display of narcissistic projection, he commanded her to admit she wanted the exact same thing. "Don't tell me what I want," she snapped, her anger finally breaking through the trauma bond. Her retaliation was instinctual. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me what I want," she warned. His jaw clenched, the predator frustrated by unexpected resistance. "I'm trying to do this cleanly," he claimed. Her laughter bordered on psychotic. "Cleanly? You think there's a clean way to do this after everything?" He weaponized her depression against her. "What everything, Elena?" The last 2 years where we barely speak. Where you walk around this place like a ghost. She stood on failing legs as refusing to absorb the blame. Don't make this about me. Don't you dare make this my fault. He maintained his clinical calm. I'm not making it anyone's fault. I'm stating facts. As she advanced, the apex predator actually treated a micro-adjustment of his footing that betrayed his underlying cowardice. She laid down the absolute facts of her devotion. Fact. I was there when you nothing. I helped you build everything you have. I stood opposite you through wars and bloodshed. Bloated with comfort, he was discarding her. Then what is it like? Victor, explained it to me. Make it make sense. When she demanded a logical explanation, his expression shifted into a patronizing mask of pity. You've been unhappy for years, Elena, he diagnosed, turning her protective emotional withdrawal and learned justification for his brutal abandonment. The repressed agony finally detonated. You checked out a long time ago because you pushed me out, she screamed. She had not withdrawn. She had been systematically exiled. I used to know everything, every plan, every risk. I was your partner. And then one day, I wasn't. Victor's tone dropped back to sub-zero temperatures. Things got complicated. The business is bigger. The stakes are higher. He claimed he needed personnel capable of functioning in that rarefied, sociopathic atmosphere. The subtext was a lethal injection to her self-worth. You think I can't operate at that level? She asked slowly. He was stating that the woman who helped dig the foundation was too weak for the fortress. Open the case file with me, if you will. We are observing Kingpin Vittorio, a classic megalomaniacal narcissist, expertly projecting his own betrayal onto his victim. He tells Luca she chose to step back, framing her as the architect of her own demise. Luca, paralyzed by the classic trauma response of Stockholm Syndrome, wants to scream and break things, yet she merely stands there shaking. She stares at the apex predator she has loved for 7 years, asking when she stopped being enough. Vittorio deflects, a textbook evasion tactic. Luca's voice fractures as she asks if another woman is waiting for him. The life lesson here is stark never seek validation from the very pathology that seeks to destroy you. Notice the clinical precision in Vittorio's deflection. He claims the decision is entirely his, a narcissistic need to maintain absolute control. Luca's bitterness becomes palpable, a corrosive defense mechanism, as she questions if the new supply knows what a monster he truly is. She presses her palm against the freezing glass, looking down at Vittorio's criminal empire. A sprawling map of fronts, illicit clubs, and warehouses. Her Stockholm Syndrome is deeply entrenched. She literally helped him build this syndicate. She threatens him with the classified knowledge she holds, data that could sentence him to multiple life terms in a maximum security facility. Behind her, the predator shifts his weight. Vittorio's vocal register drops a calculated, predatory shift I have documented in dozens of violent offenders. He asks if she is threatening him. Luca counters that it is merely a fact. Across a meticulously curated dining room, a psychological threshold is crossed. Luca realizes with devastating clarity that a megalomaniacal narcissist does not negotiate. They merely issue verdicts. Vittorio clinically transitions to logistics, mentioning lawyers and financialness as if dissolving a shell corporation. He invokes the prenuptial agreement. Luca emits a fractured, hysterical laugh, a recognized symptom of acute cognitive dissonance. True survival, we must understand, begins the moment the illusion of safety shatters entirely. In my clinical observations of psychopathy, what looks like guilt is often merely the inconvenience of being observed. Vittorio tells Luca she is strong. a patronizing pacifier meant to absolve his own actions. As he retrieves his coat and moves toward the private elevator, Luca experiences severe dissociation. Numbness overtakes her autonomic nervous system. Just as the doors open, her Stockholm Syndrome manifests in a childlike plea, begging to know if her captor ever truly loved her. Vittorio's response that he thought he did is a calculated psychological amputation. The doors seal him away, leaving Luca alone in a luxurious cell. It had never been a shared home. It was always simply his territory. Luca surveys the anniversary dinner, an opulent staging ground for what was effectively an emotional execution. Bypassing the hysterical phase entirely, her brain shifts into a flattened affect. She methodically lifts a crystal wine glass and hurls it against the reinforced security window. It shatters violently, the red liquid mimicking arterial spray across the pristine white carpet. A neurotypical subject would weep at this juncture. Luca, however, exhibits a profound emotional blunting. She describes the sensation as being surgically hollowed out, a common report from victims deeply entangled with a megalomaniacal narcissist. The candles continue to burn, oblivious to the psychological wreckage in the room. The subject experiences localized catatonia, remaining immobile for an indeterminate period before her motor functions reboot in a strictly mechanical fashion. Notice the maladaptive tidying. Packing away untouched food, extinguishing candles, hanging up coats. It is an attempt to exert microscopic control over a macro-level trauma. Proceeding to the primary bedroom, Luca begins to pack, systematically rejecting the extravagant gifts of her captor. The designer assets, the jewelry, the curated art, she recognizes them now not as gifts, but as collars. Her psychological detachment is progressing. A sudden texted notification pierces the silence. The Sawyer's house on 7th Street is prepared, the keys awaiting her retrieval. The message originates from Marcus. Kingpin Vittorio's chief of security, a fascinating behavioral outlier in this criminal syndicate, who actually perceived Luca as a human entity rather than a status object. Acknowledging if she finalizes her extraction by midnight. Bretno standing at the threshold, she evaluates the penthouse. She now clearly identifies the architecture of her Stockholm Syndrome. A maximum security citron cleverly disguised as a luxury paradise. She deliberately leaves the coagulated wine stain on the rug for Vittorio and his new target Arena to manage. Relocating to a Spartan clinical studio on 7th Street, she finds her first taste of true isolation. It is devoid of ghosts, and fundamentally, it is hers. Luca places her belongings on the narrow mattress, surrounded by the unvarnished reality of a brick wall view. Stripped of the environmental triggers of her captivity, the delayed emotional processing finally initiates. The dam breaks. She mourns not just the loss of the relationship, but the profound cognitive distortion of her own Stockholm Syndrome, 7 years of fierce, misguided loyalty to a man utterly incapable of empathy. The grief is somatic, leaving her throat lacerated and eyes inflamed, while the megalomaniacal narcissist across the city inevitably cycles to his new supply, Arena. Luca lies in the stark silence of her newly claimed reality. At 34, she must reconstruct a psyche completely dismantled by her captor. Allow me to draw your attention to the crucial transition phase of acute grief. Luca grants herself a clinical window to decompensate overnight, a necessary biological release. Yet, the subsequent morning delivers the brutal neurological phenomenon of waking amnesia. For a few fleeting seconds, her brain spares her the trauma. Then, the memory pathways reactivate, slamming her with a high-definition recall of Vittorio's casual, calculated cruelty. Forcing her physical form upright, she confronts her reflection. The physiological evidence of severe emotional distress is undeniable. Localized edema reigns around the eyes, severe dehydration and erratic dermal responses. She is looking at the raw, unfiltered aftermath of a psychological bombing. Subject utilizes temperature regulation, enduring a freezing shower in a futile attempt to physically scrub away weight CDT psychological trauma. In a textbook act of subconscious rebellion, she dons denim and oversized snitsknets for a chai captor, enacted by Ivlis deposed. Stepping onto 7th Street, Luca enters an entirely different socioeconomic ecosystem. The sterile marble and privatist security vectors are replaced by the chaotic, unscripted reality of laundromats and cheap diners. She engages in aimless pedestrian wandering, a known grounding technique for PTSD sufferers. Eventually, this deposits her before an unassuming and independent coffee house. It is the absolute antithesis of Kingpin Vittorio's meticulously controlled environments. By deliberately choosing an establishment her abuser would loathe, Luca is unconsciously remapping her neural pathways. She procures a black location and retreats to a defensible corner with a book. We note here that Kingpin Vittorio previously banned her reading habits, threatened by any attention not strictly centered on his ego. 3 pages into her cognitive reclamation, an external variable is introduced. A male subject, approximately late 30s, displaying non-threatening body language and an apologetic demeanor, inquires about the vacant chair. He exhibits 0 predatory markers. Luca grants permission for him to occupy the space. A simple, unregulated social interaction, something she has been starved of for nearly a decade. He identifies himself as Adrian. Luca provides her name, engaging in what should be a terminated data exchange. However, Adrian initiates further benign probing, observing her behavioral baseline and correctly deducing she is a newcomer to this territory. He notes her expression, mirroring it against his own baseline from 6 months prior. Luca responds with extreme caution, her defensive shield still heavily active from her prolonged exposure to the megalomaniacal narcissist. Yet, as Adrian casually critiques the commercial espresso nearby and apologizes for the interruption, an involuntary muscular response occurs in Luca's facial structure. She smiles, a genuine, uncoerced display of positive affect. The healing process has fractured the ice. For 30 minutes, they engage in baseline normative socialization. Adrian volunteers benign personal data, his profession as a freelance photographer, geographic origins in Portland, and minor medical advisories. Crucially, from a behavioral standpoint, he refrains from invasive integration. He does not treat Luca as a psychological puzzle to be rapidly disassembled, nor a commodity to be acquired and locked away. He simply validates her existence as an autonomous human being. When his device signals a scheduling conflict, he initiates a gentle disengagement from protocol. He offers a low-pressure proposition for future proximity, suggesting they might share coffee again. No demands, no leverage, just an open door. We can observe a distinct paradigm shift in the subject. That crushing sensation in Luca's sternum is no longer the agonizing withdrawal of Stockholm Syndrome. It is the tentative neurogenesis of hope. She watches Adrian depart, realizing her hypervigilance has temporarily completely deactivated. Suddenly, her device vibrates a digital summons from the Kingpin's legal proxies, demanding a meeting to dictate terms of her dismissal. You and I have seen how easily a victim can be pulled back into their abuser, but watch closely. Luca stares at the screen, processes the attempted manipulation, and deliberately places the phone face down. The gravity of narcissistic empire is broken. She is finally learning how to breathe. 3 days later, the post-Isiscard phase initiated inside a downtown glass monolith that radiated synthetic cologne and unspoken extortion. Elena arrived draped entirely in black. This was not the attire of mourning, but rather the psychological armor required to face her abuser's proxy. You and I must recognize this critical transition from victim to survivor. The attorney, Richard Moss, possessed a smile completely devoid of empathy. "Mrs. Hale," he said, sliding a massive stack of legal documents across the mahogany table. "Let's make this simple." Elena refused to physically engage with the paperwork. "Where's Victor?" she demanded, only to learn the coward had outsourced the slaughter of their marriage. Let us open this case file together and examine the inciting incident of severance. The attorney, Moss, presents the financial terms with a practiced predatory smile. The prenuptial agreement is a classic instrument of control. Elena is offered $2 million and a joint savings account of $300,000. The penthouse, the core assets, the empire she held in the construct, they remain strictly Victor's property. $2 million sounds substantial to the layman, but the context of a megalomaniac narcissist's hoard, it is a calculated insult. When she questions the ownership of the businesses she built from the ground up, the trap snaps shut. The lesson here is simple. Never build a kingdom on land owned by a tyrant. All shipping and real estate ventures are registered solely to corporate entities Victor controls. Moss clinically informs her that she holds no official position on paper. Victor had framed this exclusion as an act of protection, classic narcissistic manipulation designed to foster dependency. She realizes with sudden, crushing clarity that she has been entirely erased. 7 years of midnight strategy sessions, managing territorial disputes, and neutralizing Victor's volatile rages leave no forensic financial footprint. She was the invisible architect of his criminal enterprise, and now the ghost is being exorcised. The life lesson remains grimly clear. Invisible work yields invisible rewards. Sabor on the ledger. The attorney describes the settlement as generous, a display of Victor's supposed fairness. For Elena, the word tastes like battery acid. She is granted 48 hours to review the terms, a false window of agency in a predetermined outcome. Rising, she reclaims her maiden name, Vulov. The syllables feel entirely foreign in her mouth after 7 years of psychological subjugation. She exits the building and walks 12 blocks in a dissociative fugue state. The temporary apartment on 7th Street offers shelter, but it lacks the psychological anchor of home. We must remember a fundamental truth of human behavior. Escaping a cage does not immediately teach a bird how to survive the open sky. Freedom is terrifying. She exists in the liminal space between identities, the old ego destroyed, the new one unformed, her cellular rings breaking the silence. It is Marcus, an associate from her previous life. He asks for an emotional baseline, and he cynically offers him the $2 million figure as the total valuation of her 7-year psychological sentence. From a diagnostic standpoint, her trauma response is fascinating. She watches street birds fight over scraps, a mirror to her own sudden displacement. She asks about the new woman, Irina. Marcus hesitates. Admitting he harbored suspicions for perhaps 5 months, the behavioral pattern is clear. Betrayal rarely happens in isolation. The lesson is unavoidable. Silence from your allies is just a slower form of treason. You and I have seen this pathology before. She should exhibit rage at Marcus for his complicity, but the emotional exhaustion of her trauma bond overrides anger. She requests the demographic profile of her replacement. Irina is 26, a bartender at one of Victor's clubs, compliant and easily impressed. Marcus notes flatly that the new target has no concept of Victor's true antisocial nature. She perceives him merely as an aggressive businessman. Victor is grooming her with a synthetic fantasy. Elena closes her eyes, recalling her own initial seduction at age 27. She believed she understood the darkness she was embracing. The takeaway is chilling. We often mistake our own youthful arrogance for genuine psychological armor. Marcus admits he is violating direct orders by initiating contact, as Victor demands total isolation during the discuss-by phase. Yet, he offers a lifeline, citing a past kindness where Elena funded his sister's medical treatment. He acknowledges Victor is making a critical error, but self-preservation keeps him paralyzed. He values his physical safety over moral intervention. He tells her she deserves a sentiment that offers zero practical utility. She terminates the call and remains stationary as the city darkens. She observes the civilian population moving through their mundane and unregulated lives. The life lesson here is stark. Power and wealth often cost you the simple privilege of ordinary, boring peace. The physical ache of her envy toward normal citizens is a documented symptom of prolonged isolation. Disoriented,
she recognizes she is in the geographic vicinity of the coffee shop where she first encountered Adrian. It is 6:30 in the evening. He had established a morning behavioral routine,
so the probability of his presence is statistically low, yet she enters. The environmental stimuli have shifted drastically. Dim lighting, auditory jazz, a different demographic of nocturnal patrons completely detached from her crisis. She secures a tea and selects a window vantage point, entirely unsure of her own psychological motives. We must understand this basic principle. When the mind is entirely unmoored, the body instinctively seeks familiar coordinates. She is seeking a sanctuary or perhaps a new source of emotional regulation. Suddenly, an auditory trigger breaks her reverie. He speaks her name. Adrian stands before her. Equipped with his standard leather jacket and photographic gear, he requests permission to share her space. As he settles, her heightened hypervigilance catalogues details which she previously filtered out. A minor scar above the left eye, premature graying at the temples, calloused hands indicating physical labor. She inquires about his workday. He describes capturing corporate portraits for 75 unwilling subjects, masking the monotony with dry humor. The lesson emerges in these small interactions. True intimacy begins when we finally start observing the mundane details of another person. He pivots the interrogation, asking for her occupational status. It is the exact social metric she dreads defining. She offers a vague assertion about being in a transitional phase. He accepts this evasion without applying pressure, a stark contrast to Victor's relentless interrogations. Instead, he reads her nonverbal cues, noting she appears to be hiding from the world, joking that she belongs in witness protection. The assessment is frighteningly accurate. A genuine laugh escapes her, a rare physiological release. He then redirects the cognitive load, suggesting an exhibition at the Modern Museum focusing on urban decay. The lesson is profound. Sometimes the most effective therapeutic intervention is a simple, undemanding distraction from our pain. He describes the exhibit's focus on abandoned infrastructure and neglected spaces, areas the general public aggressively ignores. He argues there is a specific, honest aesthetic in such deterioration. To demonstrate, he presents a digital image from his device, a ruined warehouse, fractured concrete, illuminated in a way that elevates the decay into something almost holy. He states that fractured entities hold the most intrigue. Elena studies the visual evidence, her defense mechanisms. Engaging, she directly questions his benevolent motives, unable to process unconditioned kindness. He deflects with humor about his own facial structure. The psychological lesson is evident. A mind conditioned by predators will always search for the teeth behind a smile. Let us look closer at this exchange. She insists that human beings do not operate on pure altruism. He counters rather astutely that she has simply habituated herself to a toxic population. They engage in a verbal exchange lasting 2 hours, covering literature and cinematic failure aspirations, geographical use. This conversation forces a cognitive recalibration. Adrian volunteers his own biographical data. He originates from a rural sector in Oregon, possesses a fractured relationship with parents who reject his artistic choices, and experienced a collapsed engagement 5 years prior. This personal disclosure is a classic rapport-building technique. We learn a vital truth here. Vulnerability is the only known antidote to a lifetime of defensive armor. He details the mechanics of his failed pairing. His former partner required structural, suburban, and traditional family metrics. He required the chaotic pursuit of emotional resonance through his lenses. They attempted to negotiate, but as he notes, you cannot compromise on a fundamental misalignment of core values. Elena validates this assessment. When she attempts to turn the inquiry back to him regarding marriage, the psychological recoil is immediate and visible. Adrian attempts to retract the question, reading her distress. She forces the verbalization.
She is processing a divorce. Admitting the legal paperwork is a mere formality for an already dead union. The lesson's brutal but necessary.
Naming your trauma is the first step in disarming it. She quantifies the duration of the relationship.
7 years. Adrian exhibits a sympathetic grimace. She engages in a tactile soothing motion, tracing the ceramic rim of her cup.
She confesses the deepest layer of her shame. It is not the termination of the bond that haunts her, but her own complicity in the deterioration. She remained a passive observer, rationalizing the abuse, framing the toxicity as a standard marital rough patch. Adrian challenges this internalized guilt. He proposes an alternate hypothesis. Perhaps she was actively fighting to preserve a foundational belief, while the megalomaniac narcissist simply discarded her. Consider this life lesson carefully. Do not confuse your endurance of cruelty with a failure of your own moral character. A significant psychological breach occurs within her defensive perimeter. It is not a fracture, but the unlocking of a repressed emotional vault. She voiced the absolute core of Stockholm Syndrome. She has no distinctive identity outside of her captor. She assesses this identity loss as pathetic at the age of 34. Adrian reframes the cognitive distortion immediately. He defines this blank slate not as a failure, but as an unprecedented opportunity for reconstruction. He acknowledges the agonizing difficulty of the process, but rejects its impossibility. He signals his departure for an early occupational commitment. She experiences a sharp, unexpected dopamine crash at his exit. The lesson is clear. The terrifying void of the unknown is precisely where we are reborn. Today, you and I are going to open a rather fascinating case file. We are looking at a classic pattern of psychological isolation. Observe the subject, Elena. A man named Adrian offers her simple, unconditional attention, a completely foreign stimulus. She sits with her cooling tea, watching him vanish down the street. In my years analyzing the deeply traumatized, this is a defining symptom. Her captor, the megalomaniac narcissist Victor has systematically starved her of genuine connection. The lesson here is simple. True attention is the most fundamental currency of respect. A phone buzzes, an unknown number. The message is a control tactic from Victor, demanding compliance by Monday to create artificial urgency. She deletes it, but the psychological toll is paid in the dark. Lying awake, Elena experiences involuntary memory retrieval, replaying 7 years of calculated erosion. This is not about grand abuses, but 1,000 microscopic cuts. Victor disguised his dominance as protection, isolating her from his operations under the guise of keeping her safe. We see this constantly in maximum security wards. The lesson is clear. True love does not demand your confinement, nor does it ask you to disappear. The clinical term for her previous state is willful blindness, a survival mechanism intrinsic to Stockholm Syndrome. She ignored the cancelled plans and the scent of foreign perfume because confronting the reality of her marriage meant structural collapse. But tonight, a new variable emerges. Anger, not a chaotic outburst, but a cold, clarifying hostility directed inward. She resents her own complicity, her willingness to shrink her identity to accommodate a kingpin. She opens a blank notebook. The lesson we learn here is that healing often begins not with forgiveness, but with justified, quiet rage. Let us examine the timeline she constructs on those pages. At 27, she possessed autonomy. By 34, she recognizes she has been reduced to a mere prop in the theater of a megalomaniac narcissist. She catalogues the discarded versions of her own personality. She does not seek his destruction, nor his return. She seeks the retrieval of her stolen self. When dawn breaks, her hand aches from the physical exertion of writing unfiltered reality. The lesson is profound. You cannot recover your shattered identity without first facing the ugly, unvarnished truth of exactly how you lost it.
Stick with me here, because this morning marks a critical shift in her behavioral pattern. She enters the cafe as the city wakes, finding Adrian exactly where he promised to be.
A predictable environment is essential for trauma recovery. She accepts his offer of simple companionship. Their conversation lacks the heavy, manipulative subtext she is accustomed to with Victor. Over scalding coffee, a profound neurological reset occurs. She is no longer processing the world through the lens of a mob boss. The lesson is simple. Sometimes the best therapy is just coffee with someone who expects nothing. Structure is the absolute antidote to chaos. Her days settle into a therapeutic rhythm. Safe interactions in the morning, solitary cognitive processing at night. She initiates legal severing by consulting Patricia Chen, a highly aggressive attorney who immediately identifies Victor's settlement as a predatory insult. Patricia probes for a tactical advantage, asking about strategic contributions. Elena accesses past memories, recalling the nights she functioned as the psychological anchor for a volatile criminal. The lesson here: your invisible labor has immense value, even if they refuse to see it. The dilemma of the invisible accomplice. Victor, exhibiting the paranoia typical of a high-level psychopathy, ensured her contribution remained entirely verbal. Yet Patricia introduces a fascinating counter-strategy. They will turn Victor's need for strict secrecy against him. In behavioral profiling, we know that the megalomaniac narcissist dreads public exposure above all else. Patricia proposes a campaign of psychological pressure, threatening to shine a blinding light on his clandestine operations. The lesson remains stark. A bully's greatest weakness is the exposure of their own secrets. You and I must recognize the delicate boundary between a threat and a negotiation of power. Elena hesitates. A residual trace of her Stockholm syndrome makes her recoil from direct confrontation. A part of her wishes to ignite his entire criminal infrastructure, while the exhausted core simply desires a clean extraction. Patricia estimates a $5 million extraction fee, capitalizing entirely on his paranoia. Elena authorizes the strike. The lesson here is that survival often requires adopting the predator's pragmatism. Later, she seeks refuge in an exhibition of decaying, abandoned structures. She fixates on an image of a shattered apartment block, its internal organs exposed to the elements. To the untrained eye, it is a portrait of pure devastation, but Elena identifies a profound psychological resonance. Adrian materializes beside her, analyzing the exact same visual data. He values the image for its uncompromising reality. It mirrors her own internal state. The facade has been violently removed, leaving the raw truth completely visible to the outside world. The lesson is inescapable. Sometimes total destruction is the only way to clear the ground for a genuinely strong foundation. Adrian articulates the exact nature of her current cognitive state. Endings are inherently chaotic, stripped of all pretense, yet possessing a stark, clinical beauty. Prompted by this external validation, Elena verbalizes a massive behavioral milestone. She announces that the divorce papers are signed. Adrian does not offer hollow congratulations. He simply inquires about her emotional baseline. Her response shows remarkable self-awareness. They observe the remaining exhibits in shared silence. The lesson is simple. True progress often feels like standing in the ruins and refusing to look away. Notice how the introduction of a new variable triggers her defense mechanisms. Adrian proposes an incursion to a chaotic social environment, a gallery opening in the arts district. Elena's neurological reflex of isolation, the urge to retreat to her secured perimeter, but the visual of the demolished building overrides her conditioning. She recognizes that total isolation is just another form of captivity. She steps into a loud, unpredictable sensory environment. The lesson is vital. You have to force yourself into the unpredictable light to escape the familiar safety of the dark. The erratic, abstract visuals represent the exact antithesis of Victor's need for strict, predictable order. Adrian introduces a subject named Kay, a vibrant personality who openly analyzes emotional patterns. Kay immediately identifies Elena's psychological profile, diagnosing her recent marital severance with startling accuracy. She normalizes the trauma by citing her own multiple divorces. They consume cheap champagne tin to toast the incineration of past lives. The lesson here is deeply human. Shared survival is the fastest way to build a reliable bridge back to the real, breathing world. We are about to uncover the core thesis of her recovery. She isolates a specific stimulus, a violent collision of red and black pigments that forms the shape of a bird achieving flight. When Adrian requests her analytical assessment, she correctly identifies the dual nature of the image. It represents absolute rage and absolute liberation. Adrian validates this theory by recounting the furious grief of his own failed attachment. Their shared trauma creates a bridge of genuine human empathy. The lesson is fundamental. You cannot have the true freedom of flight without the white-hot anger of the cage. Let us examine the subject, Elena, as she processes profound psychological trauma. Adrian's admission of being angry and free serves as a crucial mirror. Elena reflects on Victor, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, and the 7 years of psychological dismantling she endured. She had been suppressing her rage, attempting to project an artificial maturity. In behavioral analysis, this repression is a classic defense mechanism against a dominant captor. Tonight, she begins to dismantle that wall. They exit the gallery at 10, navigating the arts district. Adrian acts as a grounding force, introducing her to environments entirely detached from her abuser. Control a late-night bookstore, a street vendor, an open rooftop. These are her first tentative steps toward genuine autonomy. Today, you and I will unpack this together. When Elena asks about his timeline, she catches herself almost uttering Victor's name. She admits she moved for someone else, a symptom of displaced identity. Victims of extreme manipulation often relocate entirely to capture their needs. Now on the crowded rooftop, she experiences a cognitive shift. Overlooking the city lights, she feels small but not diminished. This is a critical distinction. Under Victor's regime, her smallness was designed to magnify his grandiosity. Here, against the indifferent metropolis, her insignificance is beautifully liberating. The city operates independently of her trauma, offering a profound lesson. Real healing begins when we realize the universe does not revolve around our personal pain. The environment keeps moving, providing a neutral backdrop for a crucial observation. Adrian notes her lack of sorrow regarding the divorce papers, identifying her atone as relief. Elena considers employing the standard polite fictions we see in traumatized subjects, the false narrative of an amicable split. Instead, she chooses radical transparency. She details Victor's discard phase, replacing her on their anniversary and issuing a financial payout to ensure her silent exit. This is textbook behavior for a megalomaniac, treating human attachments as disposable assets. Elena's confession that she is relieved to stop pretending marks a massive breakthrough. When she tells Adrian not to apologize, her sincerity registers on a profound level. The illusion of her captivity is shattered. She vocalizes a fundamental psychological truth. Extracting oneself from a trauma bond is agonizing, but remaining tethered is lethal. Adrian responds with his own case history. His former partner equated his lack of financial ambition with personal failure, weaponizing contempt against his art. In clinical analysis, contempt is the primary predictor of systemic collapse. She viewed his autonomous choices as a direct injury to her own ego, a milder echo of Victor's pathology. When Elena asks about his recovery, Adrian charts a highly healthy arc. He transitioned from internalizing false guilt to establishing true geographic distance. He dismantled those superimposed expectations and began living an authentic existence. This exchange is a vital blueprint for her own rehabilitation. Adrian confirms relief is an inadequate term for a scheme, a destructive dynamic. As they stand together, Elena experiences a profound neurological shift. This is not the bonded intensity she mistook for love with Victor, but a genuine, empathetic connection. She thanks for treating her as an autonomous individual rather than a broken project. Victims of extreme manipulation are so accustomed to being molded that basic human respect feels revelatory. They remain in conversation until the establishment closes. Engaging in unstructured dialogue Victor never permitted, the walk to her apartment proceed at a natural, unregulated pace. Reaching her door on 7th Street, her reluctance to terminate the interaction indicates a healthy reawakening of her baseline social drive. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? She introduces her modest studio apartment, acknowledging its financial limits while fiercely claiming ownership. For a recovering subject, possessing autonomous territory is paramount. Adrian proposes a subsequent meeting without employing any coercive pressure. He offers brief physical reassurance, a simple squeeze of the hand, respecting boundaries rather than forcing an aggressive escalation. Elena ascends the stairs and secures her door, experiencing an elevated heart rate. Physiologically, this is not the adrenaline spike of hypervigilance that characterized her time with her ex-husband. It is the biological signature of authentic anticipation. For the first time in 7 years, the architecture of Victor S. wife has collapsed, leaving only the uncompromised core of Elena. She is existing in a state of chaotic freedom. Then the electronic intrusion arrives. Her legal counsel messages regarding Victor S. counteroffer, $5 million plus the savings. We must understand that for a megalomaniac, money is not merely currency. It is a mechanism of control, a leash designed to keep the victim tethered. Elena processes the figure not as wealth, but as the exact cost of her permanent disappearance from his behavioral loop. She instructs her lawyer to accept the terms immediately. When counsel suggests pushing for more,
Elena firmly shuts it down, prolonging the negotiation would simply feed Victor S' need for sustained engagement. Terminating the exchange severs his psychological supply line.
She recognizes that absolute isolation from the abuser is worth infinitely more than extended financial combat. $5 million was disproportionate to her actual contributions, but the pursuit of fairness is a trap that keeps victims entangled. The settlement occurs with alarming velocity. Within 2 weeks, she is in a sterile conference room to finalize the severing of the bond. True to the profile of a severe narcissist, Victor is physically absent. Avoiding direct confrontation during the final discard phase allows him to maintain an illusion of absolute superiority and emotional detachment. His legal proxy operates with surgical indifference, presenting the termination contracts and outlining the 72-hour window for the transfer. This is the mechanical reality of escaping a power-driven individual, the conclusion of a profoundly traumatic emotional epoch is ultimately reduced to initialed margins and automated banking protocols. The documentation guarantees absolute immunity from future litigation. Elena dissects the terminology, isolating the core psychological mandate. She is agreeing to her own historical erasure. Every corporate strategy she engineered for Victor S' empire is formally nullified. Narcissistic predators do not merely want you to leave. They want to rewrite reality so you never existed in their hierarchy at all. She applies her signature to the distortion of truth without hesitation. Exiting the facility, her lawyer offers one final opportunity to reverse the decision. Elena observes the overcast sky, an external reflection of her internal depletion. She rejects the chance to fight. Re-engaging with its Victor S. would only reignite the trauma bond. The only viable treatment plan for this level of abuse is complete, irrevocable forward motion. Stick with me, this is where it gets highly fascinating. The lawyer provides a financial referral before vanishing into the pedestrian traffic. Left isolated on the pavement, Elena experiences a textbook dissociative episode. She feels detached from her own physical form, a psychiatric phenomenon known as depersonalization. The legal tether to the Victor S ecosystem has been completely severed. She has been stripped of her artificial identity and stands entirely unanchored. Culturally, we expect this exact moment to manifest as euphoric liberation. Clinically, however, the sudden removal of a high-stress survival dynamic does not leave joy. It leaves a massive, terrifying vacuum. Her reported sensation of profound emptiness is not a failure of her recovery. It is the necessary, silent void where her genuine baseline personality will eventually be rebuilt. The dissociative void is interrupted by an incoming call from Adrian. He inquires about her appointment without violating her privacy. This displays a high level of emotional intelligence and boundary recognition traits, utterly absent in her former captor. He deduced the nature of her legal proceedings weeks prior, but chose not to interrogate her. When she confirms the divorce was finalized 20 minutes ago, his immediate focus is on her emotional state, not the logistical details. Elena reports feeling numb as she walks aimlessly. This numbness is her nervous system's finally powering down from years of chronic threat assessment. Adrian offers his presence without imposing any obligation, and she accepts. They select a neutral environment by the waterfront. Establishing new locations is vital for reprogramming a brain conditioned by trauma triggers. Upon her arrival, Adrian has secured a safe perimeter, 2 coffees, and a pastry chosen for her. He notes her physical depletion, stating plainly she looks exhausted. Under Victor S.'s regime of constant aesthetic evaluation, such a comment would be a targeted degradation. Here, it is an observation of a failing biological battery. He diagnoses her cognitive fatigue and gently insists she consume calories. Trauma survivors frequently neglect basic somatic needs. Her inability to recall her last meal indicates severe nervous system dysregulation. She eats the almond pastry, and the rich sensory input grounds her back into her physical body. As they observe the harbor in a shared, undemanding silence, her defensive numbness begins to fracture. She prepares to articulate an anomaly in her condition, confessing she expected the legal severance to magically alter her. You and I have probably both witnessed this specific fallacy in behavior. Elena expects the maniacal act of signing injunctions to instantly reconfigure her fundamental psychology. She dissects her emotional state, reporting only a sadder, more fatigued version of her existing self. Adrian validates her experience, assuring her this lack of spontaneous metamorphosis, this is perfectly standard. He delivers a crucial therapeutic insight. Terminating a trauma bond does not magically generate a new identity. It merely provides the safe vacuum required to locate the original one. He offers his own case data as evidence, describing his futile wait for a sudden revelation after his broken engagement. Healing, he explains, is an incremental, mostly unconscious process rather than a cinematic epiphany. Elena shifts her visual focus, studying him with a new, highly analytical clarity. She evaluates his behavioral profile. Adrian, understated aesthetic, of the aggressive grandiosity, typical of pathological manipulators like Victor. His primary diagnostic traits are a steady presence and a total absence of covert agendas. Elena marvels at the statistical improbability of their bond, noting that within 20 minutes of her emancipation, he is the most secure attachment figure in her ecosystem. She labels this dynamic as insane, projecting her history of chaotic relationships onto a functionally healthy one. Adrian reframes her perspective with clinical simplicity. He suggests her prior baseline for normal was heavily distorted by a sociopath. When we endure systemic abuse, basic reliability feels like a miraculous anomaly. The core lesson here is stark. True safety is not found in grand gestures, but in quiet consistency. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case file together. We are looking at a classic manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, though the physical cage was the luxury penthouse. The subject, Elena, sits across from a man named Adrian. He tells her he is not going to push her, that he knows she needs space after her 7-year psychological confinement. He demands nothing. Clinically speaking, we see an immediate autonomic nervous system response. The chronic Tension in her chest begins to untangle. She thanks him simply for allowing her to exist in a state of disarray. When a victim is accustomed to the rigid demands of a megalomaniac narcissist, the sudden absence of pressure feels like a profound and almost terrifying shock to the system. Adrian normalizes her psychological state, stating that everyone is chaotic, but she is simply more honest about it. They remain in that neutral environment as the daylight fades, engaging in what therapists call stabilizing a dialogue. He recounts mundane professional details about a demanding photography client. In return, Elena discusses her search for a new apartment, specifically noting the desire for natural light, a subconscious rejection of her previous emotional darkness. When asked if she intends to stay in the city, her ambivalence is palpable. She notes that nothing binds her, yet nothing repels her either. She repeatedly stirs an already mixed coffee, a physical self-soothing mechanism, revealing the underlying anxiety of sudden, unstructured freedom. She verbalizes the classic flight response, admitting she considered fleeing to a new city, but recognizes the futility of geographical escapes from internal trauma. She decides to stay stationary until her authentic desires resurface. Adrian correctly identifies this as healthy, though Elena admits it feels terrifying. Leaving the cafe, they walk along the waterfront without a predetermined route. This lack of structure is a critical therapeutic milestone. For the first time since severing ties with her narcissistic captor, Elena achieves a state of mindfulness. She is anchored in the present moment, walking beside a stabilizing presence who extracts no emotional toll. When he asks to show her a location, she agrees without her usual trauma-induced panic. The subject is led into unfamiliar territory, an old industrial sector, stopping at a repurposed textile factory. Adrian explains that he rents a studio inside for his photographic development. As they enter, the sensory data is chaotic but harmless: high ceilings, exposed brick, and the sharp scent of processing chemicals. We must note the environmental contrast here. Her previous life with the megalomaniac narcissist was strictly curated, sterile, and tightly controlled. This studio, located on the 3rd floor, is a sprawling space of creative disarray, covered entirely in equipment and raw images. When he activates the lights and welcomes her to his workspace, he is implicitly inviting her into a mind free of manipulation and hidden agendas. He openly admits to his own flaws, a vulnerability completely foreign to the narcissistic dynamic she recently escaped. Elena moves through the room, analyzing the scattered contact sheets and drying photographs. She observes images of urban decay environments that mirror her own internal state of ruin. However, she also discovers portraits capturing subjects in deeply unguarded, authentic states. These photographs are incredibly intimate, stripped of the performative masks her former captor demanded she wear daily. She acknowledges their beauty. Adrian accepts the praise with grounded humility. Adjusting his materials on a work table, he admits his uncertainty about why he brought her here, displaying an emotional transparency that further dismantles her defensive barriers. Adrian confronts her psychological stagnation, addressing her belief that the divorce failed to alter her identity. He introduces a critical cognitive reframe, comparing human recovery to the grainy process of developing film. He presents a faintly exposed print, explaining that early stages of identity formation are ghostly and undefined. He then shows a secondary print with sharper resolution, demonstrating the gradual emergence of clarity. Finally, he presents the fully developed image, His hypothesis is remarkably clinical yet profound that the core identity was always present within the chemical bath. The process merely forces the hidden truths to the surface. It is a brilliant deconstruction of trauma recovery, illustrating that healing is not invention, but revelation. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Elena absorbs the visual evidence and asks if she is the one developing. Adrian confirms that she is finally becoming visible to her own consciousness. Her true psyche survived the captivity. It simply requires the right environment to emerge. While this metaphor might typically register as trite, within the safety of this unstructured space, her defensive cynicism drops. She confesses a deep clinical fear, the terror of confronting her own shadow. What if she is disgusted by her authentic self? Adrian counters by destroying the concept of a fixed identity entirely. He assures her that development is a perpetual state. In this moment of intense psychological safety, the subject feels a sudden, powerful urge to kiss him. The biological impulse strikes her violently, yet higher cognitive function intervenes. This is a crucial indicator of recovery from Stockholm Syndrome. Instead of impulsively bonding to a new figure for safety, she exercises profound situational awareness. She realizes her psychological architecture is too fragile to sustain physical intimacy. She must stabilize her own foundation first. Adrian reads her non-verbal cues flawlessly and physically retreats, removing all pressure. He redirects the dynamic to basic survival needs, offering food. They relocate to a small, chaotic restaurant with plastic seating. As he orders in broken Mandarin to the amusement of the staff, they engage in trivial, spirited debates. It is the sound of a human brain learning how to play again. Returning to her apartment late into the night, the subject experiences genuine, healthy exhaustion, a stark departure from the hypervigilant fatigue typical of her past. She collapses onto the mattress, her neural pathways actively processing the unconditional acceptance she found in the studio, but the real world always intrudes. The following morning, a notification from her legal counsel shatters the peace. $5,300,000 has been wired into her possession. From a clinical standpoint, societal norms dictate a rush of dopamine, a sensation of absolute victory and relief. But trauma does not care about bank balances. Staring at the massive financial sum, Elena experiences no joy, no triumph. She only feels a crushing, heavy psychological exhaustion. Stick with me, this is where it gets interesting. The transfer is Victor's final psychological maneuver. As a megalomanic narcissist, he equates emotional currency entirely with capital. This enormous sum is his way of quantifying her 7 years of captivity. It is a severance package for a hostage. The urge to strike back flares within her. She briefly considers drafting a hostile text to force him into a moment of empathy. But her logic overrides the trauma response. She recognizes that a narcissist lacks the neural hardware for genuine remorse. Instead of engaging her abuser, she texts Adrian for coffee. He responds instantly. As she enters the cafe, noting the familiar regulars and the barista, we observe her actively laying down roots in a safe, predictable environment. Adrian intercepts her upon arrival, accurately reading her distressed microexpressions. He states that the funds have arrived, observing that she carries the specific posture of someone burdened by an unwanted fortune. He provides in caffeine a small, tangible comfort and issues a direct command to speak. Elena complies, vocalizing the profound hollowness triggered by the $5 million deposit. She articulates the core pain of the narcissistic abuse cycle. The realization that her abuser viewed their 7-year bond as a mere business transaction. She oscillates between rejecting and accepting the financial gesture, paralyzed by the conflicting emotions typical of trauma survivors. Gripping the ceramic cup to ground herself, she identifies the absolute truth. You and I have probably both witnessed this phase of recovery. She explains that the money itself is irrelevant. The damage lies in the psychological reduction of her identity. She was processed as a dismissed employee, not a human partner. Adrian applies a standard psychiatric probe, asking what specific action would provide emotional closure. Elena's breakthrough is immediate and devastating, and absolutely nothing. There is no apology or gesture the justice could perform to repair the cognitive dissonance. She deduces that she must terminate her own expectations, but Adrian pushes gently at her defenses, asking if she has truly severed the bond. Caught in the clinical beam of his question, the subject finally abandons her denial. She confesses that a fragment of her mind remains captive. She admits her psyche is still trapped inside the luxury penthouse, bonded to a fabricated persona that Victor constructed to ensnare her. A ghost. Adrian validates her admission, labeling it as fair and honest data. He applies physical grounding, briefly squeezing her hand, and reminds her that neural repatterning operates on its own timeline. The subject attempts to suppress a biological tear response, feeling undeserving of his patience. He firmly establishes his own boundaries, stating his patience is entirely his own choice. As they resume their morning ritual of unstructured walking through the urban grid, we see the foundation of a simple, meaningful lesson. Freedom from a captor is not a single explosive escape. It is built quietly in the spaces where silence finally feels safe. You and I are going to unpack this case file together, starting at the waterfront. The subject, Elena, observed the harbor traffic ferries and cargo ships moving with absolute purpose. She watched a lone sailboat slice through the gray water, triggering a repressed memory of autonomy. She confessed to Adrian that she used to sail before her captor, Victor, that dismantled her independence. Victor claimed he suffered from seasickness. In criminal behavioral analysis, we recognize this immediately. A megalomaniac narcissist cannot tolerate environments where they lack absolute control. The water is unpredictable, so he forced her to sell her vessel under the guise of financial practicality. She surrendered her escape route, entirely conditioned by the trauma bond, believing she was being a supportive partner. Adrian, acting as the stabilizing anchor in her recovery, presented a logical variable. She had $5 million from the settlement. She could simply purchase a new boat. Elena's immediate reaction was a dismissive laugh, a classic symptom of prolonged psychological captivity. To the conditioned victim, personal agency feels entirely ridiculous. She argued it had been 7 years, citing a fear of forgotten skills and the literal threat of drowning. Adrian pushed back against this learned helplessness, suggesting she could simply relearn. For the first time in nearly a decade, the subject's brain entertained a future independent of her abuser. Reclaiming a former passion seemed both terrifying and perfect. It was a microscopic step toward dismantling her Stockholm syndrome. The physiological response to trauma is immediate and unsparing. Near a coffee cart, Elena's hyper-vigilance locked onto a specific target across the street. It was Victor. The megalomaniac narcissist had already secured a new primary supply, a young woman named Irina. Elena suffered an instant amygdala hijack, her body freezing so violently that Adrian nearly collided with her. She was entirely paralyzed. consumed by the visual data of her former captor operating as if their 7-year psychological prison never existed. Victor displayed an uncharacteristic, relaxed joy. His hand rested on the new victim's lower back, a gesture that appears affectionate to the untrained eye, but is clinically recognizable as a calculated, possessive maneuver to establish initial physical dominance. Let us examine the cognitive dissonance happening here. The man across the street did not wear the cold, punishing mask Elena had endured for years. He was performing the initial grooming phase. Adrian Ertz's voice barely penetrated Elena's auditory processing as Jay watched Victor open the cab door for Irina, mirroring the exact predatory charm he used to capture Elena. When Adrian checked on her, Elena confessed that seeing him still mattered. This is the cruelest phase of the trauma bond. She articulated a profound sense of injustice, noting that it was entirely unfair for the architect of her destruction to experience happiness while she remained in pieces. She did not desire a return to captivity. She was simply grieving the devastating, lingering imbalance of power. You and I have probably both witnessed how people react to another's pain with empty platitudes. Adrian did none of that. He offered no false promises about karma or Victor's hidden misery. He simply maintained a grounded, non-reactive presence, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotional environment her captor always required. He extracted her from the trigger zone, relocating to a modern art museum. Elena collapsed onto a bench before a canvas of abstract chaos, a visual manifestation of her internal state. Her chest heaved with repressed rage. When prompted, she documented her symptoms perfectly. Anger at the abuser's seamless transition to a new host, disgust at her own lingering attachment, and fury at a universe that allowed a parasite to thrive while she struggled to function. Applying manual pressure to her eyes, Elena expressed profound shame over her retaliatory impulses. She confessed a deeply pathological desire to see Victor suffer, to force him into understanding the magnitude of his psychological crimes. She labeled herself pathetic for harboring these facets. Adrian immediately provided a clinical reframing, though he phrased it in human terms. He validated her anger, assuring her that desiring accountability from an abuser is not a defect, but a baseline human reaction to severe violation. The subject begged to know when the agonizing withdrawal of the trauma bond would cease. Adrian offered the only medically accurate prognosis. One day, the auditory pathways will reconfigure. The fear will neutralize into complete apathy or perhaps even profound pity. Adrian established a healthy boundary, reminding her immediate recovery is a physical impossibility. As the silence stretched, Elena's focus shifted to the new subject, Irina. She exhibited a textbook survivor buffer-as impulse, the desperate need to intervene and warn the incoming victim. She observed that Irina looked entirely oblivious to the logical slaughterhouse she was entering. Adrian countered with a surgical question, asking if Elena would have listened to warnings 7 years prior. Elena analyzed her younger self, heavily intoxicated by the initial love-bombing phase. Entirely to Anita certain she could manage the megalomaniac's dark world. She admitted she would not have listened, while her prefrontal cortex understood the new victim was beyond saving. Her nervous system remained trapped. The erasure of the victim's identity is the final, most devastating phase of a narcissistic cycle. Elena felt clinically deleted.
Frustrated that simply signing legal documents and accepting a financial settlement had not instantly cured her trauma. She expected an immediate cessation of symptoms.
Complaining it had been weeks, Adrian delivered a fundamental psychiatric truth. Neurological recovery is never linear. The brain oscillates wildly between baseline functionality and severe relapse. Pulling her from the bench, he guided her away from the two-dimensional paintings into a gallery dominated by structural, three-dimensional forms of bronze and steel. He halted her in front of a massive, aggressively twisted circle, initiating a physical exercise designed to disrupt her cognitive loop.
Stick with me here, because this is where intervention becomes sprint. Adrian asked her what she observed, and she identified only violent chaos in the metal.
He instructed her to walk its perimeter. As Elena physically altered her location in the room, the visual data shifted. The violent distortions resolved into deliberate, calculated patterns. Adrian used this physical object to explain the mechanics of perception. He diagnosed her current state accurately. She was observing her abuser from the most agonizing vantage point possible. She was viewing the illusion of victim happiness from the epicenter of her own withdrawal symptoms. He made her realize that the image of the invincible captor was merely an optical illusion generated by her specific position in her grief. Elena logically demanded to know the correct angle to view her trauma from. Adrian clarified that no single perspective cures the pain, but constant inside cognitive movement prevents permanent paralysis. A victim cannot remain cemented in the moment of their discard. They must continuously circle the wreckage of their life until the structure of the abuse becomes clear, exposing the captor's underlying frailty. Elena continued to pace around the steel, actively retraining her brain to accept shifting realities. She correctly identified his method as deeply therapeutic. Adrian deflected with humor, claiming he simply photographed broken structures, but his strategy was flawless. He then commanded a total pivot, insisting they engage in an activity entirely devoid of her abuser's shadow. He challenged her to recall the last time she engaged in an activity strictly for pleasure. The complete amnesia regarding personal joy is a hallmark of severe psychological suppression. They relocated to a batting cage. Elena Vess' initial attempts were uncoordinated, her nervous system still locked in a freeze response. But Adrian provided calm, non-judgmental correction. He did not berate her failures. He simply adjusted her mechanics. When she finally connected, the kinetic transfer of energy provided a massive somatic release. Striking the baseball allowed her body to safely discharge the aggressive survival energy that had been trapped inside her since seeing Victor. She swung until her musculature fatigued, replacing her trauma-induced paralysis with genuine, exhausting physical laughter. During the extraction back to the vehicle, Elena experienced a significant decrease in her cortisol levels. She was not cured. Stockholm Syndrome does not dissolve after a single afternoon of baseline human activity, but the crushing density of her trauma had fractured. She expressed gratitude, thanking Adrian for actively blocking her psychological spiral. In a maneuver completely foreign to her, Adrian refused to take the credit, insisting she did the internal work herself.
This lack of grandiosity confused her conditioned mind. Arriving at her apartment, she hesitated. Victims of severe manipulation constantly search for the hidden agenda in acts of kindness.
She confronted him directly, demanding to know his motive for investing time in a subject who offered zero transactional value. Adrian answered her with a level of transparencies that is lethal to a megalomaniac's playbook. He stated plainly that he valued her authentic, chaotic self over the perfectly compliant mirror she had been forced to become for Victor. He admitted to seeing a latent strength in her that she was currently blind to, and wanted to witness its emergence. This unconditional, non-coercive validation overwhelmed her system. It felt dangerously intimate. Adrian quickly diffused the tension by criticizing his own intense honesty, mentioning his ex-partner Katie, who had fundamentally misdiagnosed him as lacking ambition. Elena immediately defended him, her psychological framework stabilizing enough to accurately assess his character. He recognized his ambition simply wasn't rooted in ruthless dominance. You and I need to pay very close attention to this final sequence. Inside her apartment, her nervous system finally reached a state of rest. Then a text arrived from Marcus, a proxy in their social circle. Victor had deliberately inquired about her while parading his new victim. This is clinically known as a hoovering maneuver. The narcissist, sensing a loss of control, tests the perimeter to see if the trauma bond is still active. But instead of triggering a full relapse, Elena observed the manipulation with detached clarity. Marcus had relayed that she was thriving, dealing a critical blow to her former captor's ego. She smiled, finally internalizing a simple, profound truth. The ultimate defense against a megalomaniac is the absolute indifference of a life well lived.
Let us open the case file on our primary subject, Elena. You and I are going to examine the precise moment a severe trauma bond begins to snap. She typed a simple confirmation to Adrian, yes.
She was doing better. This was a radical cognitive shift. She observed the city lights, grounding herself in a reality no longer distorted by Victor, a man exhibiting every hallmark of a megalomaniac narcissist. She possessed $5 million and a terrifying void of autonomy. It was an imperfect existence, highly vulnerable to regression, but the locus of control was finally hers. The lesson here is clinical, but profound freedom rarely feels like triumph. Usually, it just feels like breathing. 3 weeks of this fragile baseline passed. For 21 days, the subject maintained a strict detachment protocol. Morning routines with Adrian served to rewire her hypervigilant nervous system. She browsed sailboats online, a textbook manifestation of reclaiming suppressed desires. But narcissists rarely let their former supply drift away untested. The intrusion occurred in a grocery store, a mundane environment where her defenses were naturally lowered. Her voice triggered an instant physiological threat response. Victor stood 3 feet away. He had shed his usual psychological armor, wearing a plain black sweater. He appeared fatigued, a clear symptom of narcissistic decompensation. He was testing the perimeter, searching for a crack in her newly constructed boundaries. Note her physiological regulation during this encounter. She maintained vocal stability when addressing her former captor. Her response was a neutral deflection about living in the neighborhood, deliberately denying him the emotional reaction he sought. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the ambient hum of the store. When Victor stated she looked light of dog, he was unconsciously observing the absence of the psychological weight he had forced her to carry. He requested a brief dialogue at a nearby coffee shop. Her amygdala, the threat detection center of the brain, was screaming at her to flee. The survival instinct always recognizes the predator, even when he approaches with a calm demeanor and an open, empty hand. The narcissist's greatest weapon is the illusion of vulnerability. It bypasses logic and exploits the deep empathy of the victim. Elena observed his seemingly fractured state and conceded a 10-minute window. They sat in a crowded, neutral environment, functioning as strangers rather than former codependents. Victor initiated a superficial diagnostic check, noting she accepted the financial settlement. He claimed he wanted her taken care of. This is classic narrative manipulation, rewriting history. He remains the benevolent provider. Elena rejected the conditioning. She demanded to know his true motive. True psychological healing requires piercing the manipulator's script and demanding cold, uncompromising empirical reality. Victor attempted a post-discard rationalization, asserting that dissolving their dynamic had been emotionally taxing for him. You and I have seen this specific pathology 1,000 times behind prison glass. He genuinely expected maternal validation for inflicting severe psychological trauma. The subject experienced a sudden, appropriate surge of hostility. Reich angers is a necessary mechanism in dismantling Stockholm Syndrome. She outlined the absolute facts he found a younger, more compliant source of narcissistic supply and abandoned her. Victor tried to introduce complexity where there was none, a tactic designed to confuse the victim. The most powerful defense is simply refusing to complicate the plain, unforgiving truth. When deprived of control, the narcissistic subject displays visible physical tension. Victor's jaw tightened. He deployed the concept of doing the right thing, a fascinating moral inversion. Elena correctly identified the underlying pathology. His presence was entirely self-soothing. He required her absolution to stabilize his own fractured ego. She recognized the asymmetry of his logic, stood up and initiated a boundary reinforcement. She terminated the interaction. This triggered an immediate panic response in Victor. He physically reached out, attempting to anchor her in his sphere of influence. He begged for 5 more minutes, promising a real explanation. He was bargaining, desperate to prevent the total duselessarmovism. Elena conceded the time, sitting back down. For the first time, the megalomaniac displayed genuine structural discomfort. He confessed that his new primary supply, Arena, was failing to meet his psychological demands. After merely 3 months, the idealization phase had collapsed. He complained that his new partner lacked the capacity to reflect his perceived greatness, desiring only the superficial rewards of his status. Then came the calculated maneuver, the classic hoovering phase. He stated he had made a fatal error. He dangled this admission like bait, waiting for her trauma bond to activate. The harsh reality of human behavior is that people rarely return out of genuine love. They return because their new reflection is broken. We might expect the subject to experience a massive surge of dopamine here, the ultimate vindication of the discarded victim. Instead, Elena registered profound emotional fatigue. This is the absolute clinical marker of a severed bond. She diagnosed his error with surgical precision. His mistake was not the abandonment itself, but his delusional belief that his internal void could be cured by a fresh, uncritical supply. He had grown complacent, seeking a blank slate rather than doing the usually excruciating reform. She laid out his prognosis, and clearly he would repeat his pathological cycles with Arena. The inescapable lesson is this: changing your environment changes nothing if the architecture of your mind remains the same. Victor attempted a weak denial, but the behavioral evidence was undeniable. Elena maintained a regulated, almost maternal tone. The root of his pathology was a complete absence of internal identity. Then Victor delivered the ultimate manipulation, suggesting she was his true desire. Let us examine this critically together. 6 weeks prior, this stimulus would have triggered an overwhelming emotional relapse. Now, it generated only distant clinical pity. She identified his core cognitive error. He did not desire her. He desired the subservient, isolated version of her he had meticulously programmed over 7 years. That specific psychological construct had been permanently dismantled. He was hunting a ghost in an empty house. She firmly rejected the assigned role, cementing her psychic autonomy. Victor offered the desperate plea that human beings can evolve. She applied a brutal empirical test, asking for evidence of his own evolution during the past 3 months. The resulting silence was a profound admission of guilt. He had merely substituted one dependent object for another. She established a permanent boundary, though the door was definitively sealed. As she exited the environment, she exhibited acute sympathetic nervous system's arousal tremors, elevated heart rate, but the overriding cognitive state was absolute clarity. She realized the concept of closure from an abuser is a myth. True closure is simply the act of walking away and refusing to look back. Let us note the complete reversal of the power dynamic. The future, while the megalomaniac remained trapped in his own historical loop. A stimulus arrived via her phone. Adrian proposed a culinary engagement. Her response was immediate and highly positive. They negotiated the terminology of their interaction, stumbling over the definition of a date. This is the awkward, necessary friction of healthy socialization. She recognized a burgeoning attachment to Adrian. She mentally documented the positive reinforcements he provided: urge, active listening, emotional reciprocity, a steady, unthreatening gaze. He offered validation without the underlying threat of sudden withdrawal. He saw the person, not the reflection. Despite this healthy stimulus, her psychological immune system remained highly guarded. Readiness is a spectrum, not a simple switch. Upon returning to her safe zone, she initiated contact with Marcus, effectively updating her support network on the breach in her perimeter. She reported the narcissistic intrusion and Victor's sudden dissatisfaction with his new primary supply. Marcus probed for data regarding her reaction. She confirmed her firm boundary enforcement. They analyzed the failure of the new dynamic. Arena lacked the intensive conditioning required to tolerate the harsh reality of a criminal narcissist's existence. The clinical takeaway here is vital fantasies always collapse when subjected to the crushing weight of reality. Marcus provided a realistic timeline for the complete structural collapse of Victor's current dynamic, predicting a return attempt within 4 weeks. Elena rejected the possibility of a relapse, but Marcus understood the behavioral profile of the megalomaniac. When a narcissist experiences a deficit in supply, their cognition becomes highly dysregulated. They employ aggressive retrieval tactics to reclaim what they view as their absolute property. He warned her to anticipate a severe escalation in manipulation. Elena visualized the emotional turbulence on Victor's face, a toxic cocktail of regret and supreme entitlement. She embraced the impending friction with a fortified core. Let the predator push. The newly built fortress walls would hold. Stick with me as we observe a crucial milestone in her recovery. Marcus offered to act as an external buffer against further intrusions. Terminating the call, she surveyed her immediate environment. The space was geographically limited and furnished with discarded second-hand items. Yet, functionally, it was a masterpiece of autonomy. For 7 years, her reality, curated, infected, and strictly governed by a psychological tyrant, she had finally claimed an uncontaminated territory. Later that evening, she engaged in the proposed dinner with Adrian. They occupied a small chaotic restaurant, debating trivial preferences like fruit on a pizza. It was remarkably ordinary, and for a survivor of severe trauma, ordinary is a miracle. Elena exhibits early signs of breaking the trauma bond. Debating pizza toppings with Adrian provides a crucial neurological reset. In my years analyzing the victims of megalomaniac narcissists and shared trivial laughter is exactly when Stockholm Syndrome begins to fracture. She feels a profound lightness because the cognitive dissonance is finally fading. When she mentions Victor, the apex predator of her past, her tone remains chillingly flat. "We're done," she says, taking a measured sip of her wine. It is a clinical, precise severing of the emotional supply line he once relied upon. The psychological control is finally shifting. Observe the psychological baseline stabilizing. Here, Elena acknowledges her own recovery, moving from a state of hypervigilance to a neutralized peace. She credits Adrian, but her recovery is entirely her own. The megalomaniac narcissist conditioned her to blood. She was fundamentally broken, a common tactic to maintain absolute psychological control. Adrian's presence provides a secure attachment style, devoid of frantic manipulation. He didn't try to fix her, which is crucial for her rehabilitation. Healing from this level of abuse isn't about being saved by another. It is about finding the safe environment required to save yourself. Used to wire ström detention with them next manifestation of healthy neurochemical bonding, replacing the adrenaline spikes of her past. But reality intrudes when a phone rings. While Adrian handles a familial crisis, Elena is left observing the room. She studies the baseline of human interaction, couples dining, children playing, the mundane rhythm of existence. She craves this banal normalcy. After surviving the psychological warfare of a kingpin's empire, boredom isn't just desirable. It is the ultimate sanctuary for a shattered nervous system seeking equilibrium. The realization hits her not with the manic intensity of a trauma bond, but with the quiet clarity of cognitive realignment. She desires Adrian. She desires the absolute absence of chaos.
No corporate espionage, no emotional landmines. When Adrian returns distressed over his father's sudden hospitalization,
we see a complete reversal of her past behavioral dynamic. With Victor, emergencies were manufactured crises designed to isolate and manipulate her. Here, the crisis is genuine, external, and human. She doesn't panic. She calmly directs him to go be with his family. It is a masterclass in newly acquired emotional regulation. A simple kiss on the cheek, yet it speaks volumes and is about her behavioral shift. She walks home alone, but the isolation is no longer a punishment. It is a space for healthy processing. She experiences an empathetic drive to support Adrian, contrasting the obligatory servitude demanded by her former captor. She analyzes their relationship parameters. Friends? No. The physiological responses, racing heart, intrusive romantic ideation, indicate a much deeper attachment. She wants to eradicate her traumatic history and begin anew. Then, the psychological trigger arrives, breaking the silence. The phone rings. The past is demanding an audience. Here we witness the classic extinction burst of the megalomaniac narcissist. Victor realizes his primary target is slipping away, so he aggressively escalates. 1 call, 2 calls, 3. It is a siege tactic designed specifically to wear down her boundaries. When she finally answers, he issues immediate commands, attempting to re-establish his dominance. He threatens to physically invade her safe space. Elena's capitulation, granting him 1 single hour at a neutral location, is a calculated risk. It is a residual reflex of her Stockholm Syndrome, the deeply ingrained belief that she can manage the predator by tossing him a scrap of compliance. Stick with me, this is where the clinical picture sharpens. There is a dark, lingering curiosity in the survivor's mind, a desire to witness the megalomaniac finally stripped of his power. She chooses a dimly lit establishment, the theater of his former manipulative triumphs, and orders whiskey for chemical armor. She feels unhinged, an entirely normal physiological response when willingly stepping back into a psychological cage. Victor redeems with terrifying punctuality. He sits, orders his scotch, and analyzes her. He looks at her not with genuine affection, but like a predator assessing a former territory that has suddenly grown new, dangerous defenses. You seem stronger. He identifies the psychological threat immediately. Elena's retort is sharp, completely devoid of the deference he expects. He then pivots to a well-worn manipulation tactic, the weaponization of vulnerability. He admits fault. He discards his current supply arena with chilling clinical detachment. She is nice, he says, which in the narcissist lexicon simply means she is no longer providing adequate ego validation. He claims he misses the challenge Elena provides, her humanity. He misses the specific friction she offered to polish his grandiose self-image. Elena directly confronts his revisionist history, correctly identifying his previous demand for an obedient, unquestioning partner. Victor's countermaneuver is fascinating to observe. He proposes a fresh start. This is the psychological reset button narcissists frequently deploy. We do not want to pretend the profound betrayal, thereby feigning accountability. He positions his infidelities and calculated cruelty as mere mistakes rather than intentional abuse. He is attempting to construct a new reality, one where his absolute destruction of the marriage is simply the prologue to his grand redemption. He breaches her physical boundary, taking her hand. It is a highly tactical touch designed specifically to trigger the muscle memory of their trauma bond. He promises her the one thing he systematically denied her, an equal partnership. But Elena's cognitive defenses hold firm. She articulates a foundational truth of behavioral psychology right to his face. People with his pathology do not fundamentally change. Their core megalomania remains completely intact. They merely adapt their camouflage. She recognizes that returning to him means returning her own reserve, slowly losing her identity to fuel his endless void. She pulls her hand away. Elena meticulously dissects his behavioral loop. She outlines the cycle of abuse with forensic precision, the idealization phase, the inevitable boredom, the subsequent devaluation, and the final discard. She knows his operational metrics better than he does. I know your patterns, she states. When he protests the unfairness of her assessment, she coldly throws his own nihilistic worldview back at him. She stands up. This physical elevation is a literal manifestation of her reclaimed autonomy. She delivers her verdict with absolute finality. The access is denied. The psychological supply is permanently cut off. I love you. He deploys the ultimate emotional weapon. He looks lost, a megalomaniac suddenly deprived of his primary mirror. But Elena sees entirely through the projection. She accurately diagnoses his affection. He is mourning a phantom, the impliant version of her from 7 years prior. That woman, broken and molded by his demands, no longer exists. She asserts her new identity, undefined but fiercely her own. Walking out of that bar, she doesn't just leave a man, she leaves the psychological prison he built. The lesson here? True freedom requires burying the version of yourself that your captor loved. The auditory trigger of him, calling her name, completely fails to halt her momentum. Once secured inside her vehicle, a physical and psychological airlock, the physiological release occurs. She weeps. In my clinical experience, these tears are rarely for the abuser. They are tears of profound grief for for the self that was sacrificed on the altar of a narcissist's ego. She mourns the naive girl she was and honors the complex, battle-scarred woman she is finally becoming. Then, a tether to the real world buzzes. A message from Adrian, simple, factual, considerate. A stark, grounding contrast to the emotional vortex she just escaped. You and I are going to look at this final piece together. Her response to Adrian is measured. She requests coffee, a normal daylight interaction. As she drives, she clinically processes Desaigne's Victor East performance. Months ago, the Stockholm Syndrome would have compelled her to accept his counterfeit promises. She would have believed the illusion of change. But her neuropathways have rewired. She now understands that love devoid of respect is simply manipulation masquerading as affection. She has learned the ultimate lesson of survival. A predator only values the prey once it has escaped the trap. She is finally, irrevocably out of his reach.
The subject, Elena, stabilizing force, an attachment figure who provides consistent positive reinforcement without the threat of sudden withdrawal. Someone exactly like Adrian.
The mere concept triggers her residual flight response. Having just severed the trauma bond, replacing one hypervigilant attachment with another appears clinically catastrophic. Yet, she perceives this not as a reckless leap, but a controlled descent. Returning to her sanctuary, she prepares tea. She positions herself by the glass, observing the urban grid below, and catalogues the fragmented identity she has inhabited. The lesson here is fundamental survival requires us to shed the psychological skins that no longer serve us. Let us examine her psychological evolution. We see the naive 27-year-old subject who initially bonded with Victor, then the spouse who engaged in chronic self-erasure as a primary survival mechanisms. Finally, the clinician signing the dissolution papers. This new iteration of her personality is chaotic, highly volatile, and fundamentally unanchored, yet it displays remarkable authenticity. She is finally claiming spatial dominance rather than shrinking to appease a narcissistic host. Her device vibrates. The megalomaniacal or narcissist is probing her boundaries. She diverts it. 3 more attempts follow before she initiates a hard block. She will represent these vital data points data to Adrian tomorrow. If her dopamine pathways stabilize enough to counteract her fear, she intends to deliver an even more terrifying confession. She's developing a profound emotional dependence on him. She is entirely destabilized, oscillating between terror and irrational optimism. But that cognitive load is deferred to the next solar cycle. Tonight, she remains in a static state of observation by the window, ingesting her warm beverage, existing solely in the present baseline. As a subject who has amputated a diseased limb and is now learning to walk with a prosthetic of her own design, it is a vital truth. Healing is rarely elegant. It is a brutal reconstruction. Precipitation arrives with the dawn, aggressive against the glass. Her circadian rhythms are thoroughly disrupted. Her prefrontal cortex churns through the impending dialogue with Adrian, the re-emergence of the predator, the confrontation in the establishment, the crystallization of her intent to abandon her previous conditioning. The coffee shop serves as a neutral environment, practically devoid of other human variables seeking refuge from the atmospheric pressure. Adrian occupies a table, dual caffeinated stimulants prepared, his hair holding the environmental moisture. He observes her physical exhaustion immediately. The lack of REM sleep is written into her micro-expressions. She grips the ceramic vessel, utilizing the thermal output to ground her spiraling nervous system. She initiates the disclosure protocol, The apex predator made contact following Adrian's departure to the medical facility, demanding an audience. Adrian maintains facial neutrality, yet his pupils betray a subtle autonomic spike. Against all clinical advisement, she complied and engaged the source of her trauma. She exhales, a somatic release. Victor presented a narrative of regret, citing the failure of his secondary supply, and demanded his primary supply return. Her refusal was absolute, severing the residual threads of Stockholm syndrome. A narcissist reacts to rejection as a physical assault. The fallout was severe, culminating in her technological quarantine of his communications. She demands Adrian understand this permanence. She vocalizes a definitive boundary. That timeline is permanently terminated. Adrian offers a minimal affirmative response. The implicity of it provokes her. He leans back, adopting a non-threatening posture, admitting his internal anxiety and subsequent relief while reinforcing her autonomy. True agency is the ultimate cure for systemic coercion, but she requires him to analyze the deeper motivation behind her refusal. It was not merely a rejection of a toxic stimulus, it was an active selection of a positive one. Adrian's motor functions freeze completely. She commands him to hold his verbal response, severing her physical connection to the beverage. These recent weeks, she notes, provided her only neurochemical stability. He provided consistent, non-transactional support. He processed her verbal trauma dumps. He stimulated her serotonin production when she believed her receptors were permanently damaged. In this environment of safety, a new attachment formed. Adrian attempts a clinical intervention of his own, suggesting her emotional data might be corrupted by the trauma of her separation, warning her against misinterpreting survival gratitude as genuine affection. Her defense mechanism engages instantly, though her tone lacks aggression. She prohibits him from dictating her internal state. She has mapped the topography of both gratitude and romantic fixation, and their physiological signatures are distinct. She accepts the risk of future fallout. She breaches the physical barrier in initiating tactile contact with his hand. The declaration is explicit. She desires to pursue this behavioral experiment to its conclusion. Adrian studies the interlaced digits, vocalizing a profound fear of contaminating the dynamic. The subject reciprocates the anxiety. The legal severing of her previous bond is barely processed. The statistical probability of a rebound failure is exceptionally high, yet she displays an adaptive flexibility, noting that this risk might be the exact therapeutic intervention they require. He maintains in silence, processing these variable before applying gentle pressure to her hand. He confesses a long-standing fixation dating back to her initial manifestation in this space. She dismantles his perceived hierarchical barrier. He exhibits the authentic facial relaxation that has become her primary soothing mechanism. They mutually agree that this deviation from protocol is highly risky and necessitates a decelerated timeline. No external parameters, no projected outcomes. They remain tethered across the surface, the atmospheric condensation striking the glass, while her autonomic nervous system finally achieves equilibrium. It is not an absolute certainty her previous captor cured her of that cognitive distortion, but rather the emergence of self-determination. His device interrupts the synchronization. A scheduled interaction requires his departure. They arrange a nocturnal rendezvous at his coordinates. He initiates a standing position, then pauses to deliver a diagnostic assessment. He labels her behavioral pattern as courageous. She rejects the classification, experiencing only the internal friction of the struggle. He notes that authentic bravery rarely registers as such, to the host organism. A soft press of his lips to her prefrontal area, and he exits. She observes his departure, noting a significant reduction in her psychological burden. The trajectory ahead is chaotic, yet it is entirely under her jurisdiction. Her communication device activates. An informant, Marcus, transmits a warning. The megalomaniac is hunting for her new coordinates. She processes the threat matrix and deploys a countermeasure to enforce her boundary. The informant confirms percussion compliance, initiating a standard wellness check. For the first time in her documented history, her affirmative response is not a trauma-induced fabrication. She terminates the session at the cafe and navigates the precipitation without protective shielding. The dropping temperature and moisture penetrate her outer layers, adhering her hair to her face structure. Instead of distress, this sensory overload triggers a profound autonomic awakening. She is chaotic, adrift, yet functioning in optimal alignment with her core identity. The subsequent hours are a blur of necessary executive functions. She executes the transfer of capital acquired from the dissolution, solidifying her essential resource independence. She evaluates potential habitat structures equipped with functional zones completely devoid of her former captor's aesthetic influence. She even acquires informational material on maritime navigation, a clear indicator of expansive future orientation. As the diurnal cycle ends, she experiences anticipatory anxiety, though of a beneficial nature. His dwelling, located in a creative sector, requires a physical ascent. The perimeter is lined with his visual documentation, intimate, uncurated captures of raw existence. He issues an apology for the environmental disorder to a subject escaping the sterile, hyper-controlled terrarium of a mob boss. This organic chaos is deeply regulating. They established a cooperative rhythm in preparation. They ingest a low-tier phenol compound, deliberately avoiding the intense emotional disclosures of the morning session. The auditory environment is filled with complex musical patterns that facilitate his cognitive flow. You and I must look closely at her next inquiry. She asks about his professional. Why the specific medium? He manipulates the carbohydrate strands on his utensil, formulating a precise response. He exhibits a compulsion to freeze transient temporal data. Human existence is highly volatile, prone to sudden erasure. His apparatus allows him to extract and preserve isolated data points. It serves as empirical proof of survival. When you document the truth, you deny the predators their power to rewrite history. He reverses the interrogation, probing into her baseline aspirations prior to the trauma. Her original objective was the acquisition of legal authority, specifically the prosecution of malignant elements to enforce societal safety. Then, she intersected with Victor, the exact psychological profile she aimed to incarcerate. She fell victim to the narcissistic illusion that her emotional investment could rewire his antisocial personality disorder. She misdiagnoses her past self as intellectually deficient. He corrects the cognitive distortion, labeling it misplaced optimism. She argues the absolute loss of her potential discarded when the narcissist required new supply. Yet Ayan challenges her to locate the adaptive benefit she gained. Let us open this case file together, you and I. We're observing a classic recovery phase following prolonged psychological subjugation. Experience and the knowledge of what a subject does not want come at a steep psychological cost. Elena finished her nutritional intake and retreated to the couch, curling inward, a defensive posture softening into genuine ease. This environment lacked the coercive control of the expensive venues her former captor, Victor, utilized. Adrian asked to show her something. He retrieved a physical photo album, an artifact of tangible reality rather than digital illusion. Sitting close enough for to establish physical trust without triggering her trauma response, he opened it to his past engagement. The visual stimuli presented a baseline for Adrian. There he was with the blonde woman, Katie, laughing, sharing ice cream, exhibiting the unblemished optimism of youth. They appeared convinced their trajectory was fixed. Elena questioned his motive of displaying this data. Adrian's response was a masterclass in emotional regulation. He explained that the relationship had degraded into mutual psychological warfare during its final year, yet he insisted this deterioration did not invalidate their prior joy. He turned to a photograph of them at sunset, demonstrating an advanced cognitive capability to separate past affection from present outcome. Adrian proposed a radical cognitive reframe. The termination of a bond does not classify it as an error. He suggested that Elena's time with Victor, the megalomaniac narcissist who shaped her 20s, served a functional purpose that perhaps she needed that high-stress crucible to discover her own resilience. Perhaps Victor required her empathy to construct his persona. Elena exhibited a spontaneous stress release laugh. Adrian maintained his thesis outgrowing a subject is an acceptable biological reality. She studied his ocular micro-expressions, finding zero traces of judgment. Failed interpersonal dynamics, he noted, offer superior data sets compared to successful ones. You and I have observed this critical junction in many subjects. Success requires minimal introspection, while systemic failure forces a complete psychological audit.
Ilana reduced the physical distance between them, thanking him for acknowledging the nuanced reality of her condition. Requires emotional labor.
The environmental variables, the rhythmic rain, the low auditory stimulation facilitated a breakthrough. Elena confessed her fear. She was terrified of experiencing authentic affectation, afraid her underlying trauma would sabotage the interaction. Adrian provided crucial clinical validation. She was not permanently damaged, merely healing. He then mirrored her vulnerability, confessing his fear of being a transitionary figure. He articulated the fear of being the secure alternative rather than the primary fixation. Elena countered this hypothesis with sharp behavioral insight. A transitionary attachment, she noted, encourages avoidance and regression. In contrast, his presence stimulated a desire for authentic presentation. She placed her hand over his, establishing voluntary somatic contact. She wanted to present her true psychological profile, abandoning the compliant persona she had manufactured to survive Victor's manipulation. Adrian advanced slowly, offering a clear avenue for withdrawal. She remained stationary. Their initial physical contact was an exploratory mechanism, fracturing years of meticulously maintained emotional suppression. Adrian stabilized his forehead against hers, a grounding technique, confirming the shift in their dynamic parameters. The illusion of their platonic baseline was permanently dismantled. During their secondary, more prolonged physical engagement, Elena registered a profound internal reorganization. This was not a structural collapse, but the unlocking of a deeply guarded psychological compartment. The contrast to her former captor was stark. This interaction operated on egalitarian principles and transparent data, devoid of the volatile intensity characteristic of her ongoing Stockholm Syndrome. They remained positioned on the verge until midnight, negotiating the complex mechanics of mutual emotional rehabilitation. Stick with me here. This is the exact moment the trauma bond begins to dissolve. They established no permanent contractual obligations, operating entirely within the present moment. Upon her departure, Adrian is ordered through the precipitation, his farewell physical contact exhibiting a distinct protective anxiety.
He secured a verbal commitment for a geographic status update upon her arrival.
Her internal dialogue shifted toward cautious optimism.
When questioned on the certainty of this positive outcome,
Adrian admitted a complete lack of empirical proof, yet opted for voluntary belief. With the narcissist, her compliance had been a survival mechanism dictated by profound psychological fear, not genuine faith. Now, her belief was driven by intrinsic motivation, a textbook indicator of neural recovery. Over the subsequent weeks, they established a predictable, stabilizing rhythm. Routine exposure, morning coffee, nutritional intake, locomotive therapy through urban environments allowed her nervous system to finally regulate. They maintained a deliberate velocity, recognizing that her architectural integrity was still fragile, but gradual progress is not paralysis. Elena engaged in aquatic navigation training, reacquiring the physics of wind and intention. She secured a structurally superior habitat, prioritizing natural light over the dark, suffocating enclosures associated with Victor's financial empire. Adrian operated as a supportive, non-intrusive variable within her immediate environment. He documented her behavioral milestones through photography, capturing authentic responses devoid of performative anxiety. She accused him of fixation, but he correctly identified her lack of artificiality as a statistically rare phenomenon. She was no longer performing, she was simply existing. 3 months into this stabilization phase, an external disruptor breached the perimeter. A contact named Marcus initiated communication, suggesting she secure a seated position to brace for impact. The megalomaniac narcissist had terminated his latest primary supply. The dissolution was highly public, chaotic, and aggressively theatrical. If you and I analyze her metrics in this moment, the results are fascinating. The gossip permeated the societal network. Elena monitored her internal state for the anticipated surge of vindication or residual attachment, but the psychological pathways were dormant. She registered only a detached clinical pity. Marcus reported that the subject was deteriorating, engaging in substance abuse and erratic decision-making. Predictably, the narcissist was attempting to re-establish contact with his former supply. Elena instructed Marcus to transmit a specific data packet. She surveyed her new territory, filled with acquired artifacts and Adrian's visual documentation. "Tell him I have achieved optimal stabilization," she directed. Within 48 hours, the pathological subject manifested at her geographical coordinates. Observing from an elevated vantage point, Elena analyzed his erratic loitering. She possessed the tactical advantage vintage non-engagement, yet a lingering trace of her former conditioning compelled her to initiate contact. She descended to the street level. Victor's physical presentation was severely degraded. He exhibited extreme physiological exhaustion, the inevitable crash of a collapsed, grandiose facade. He attempted a tentative verbal probe, utilizing her relocation as a conversational entry point. Elena maintained a strict physical perimeter, her custom sourcing in a closed defensive posture against his manipulation. Victor engaged in vocal throat clearing, a physical manifestation of his internal cognitive dissonance. He admitted the cyclical nature of his failures, the variables changed, but his behavioral algorithm remained fixed. He expressed a futile desire to overwrite his core programming. Elena delivered a clinical assessment. Personality modification requires intrinsic dedication, not merely the vocalization of intent. Victor's ocular responses indicate high emotional volatility as he claimed a desire to align with her original, idealized projection of him. Elena efficiently dismantled this fantasy. That entity was a fabrication, she stated. He then initiated a direct inquiry regarding her current interpersonal status. She possessed the option to deploy a tactical deception to de-escalate the encounter, but prioritized her own psychological integrity. She confirmed her new attachment. Victor's facial architecture visibly destabilized at the loss of his asset. She clarified that her current optimal state was not entirely dependent on the new partner, but on the restoration of her own autonomous identity. Desperate, Victor offered a retroactive concession, promising the environmental freedom he had previously denied. Elena delivered a definitive negative. He had possessed 84 months to implement those protocols. She refused to suspend her development while he attempted to master the fundamental mechanics of mutual respect. Stick with me for this final observation. This is where the subject entirely reclaims her agency, offering a profound lesson. He deployed the ultimate manipulation tactic, declaring his enduring affection. Elena countered with absolute clinical precision. Affection devoid of baseline respect is merely auditory interference. She diagnosed his fundamental pathology. He had never perceived her as an independent entity, only as a utility designed to reflect his own manufactured grandeur. True recovery, we learn here, requires discarding familiar chaos for unfamiliar peace. She concluded the interaction with a directive, hoping he might eventually secure a complementary component that could tolerate his psychological vacuum without being annihilated. Let's examine the exact moment a trauma bond breaks. You and I have seen this in maximum security files. The exact second the victim stops seeing the captor as a god. Elena turned her back on Victor, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist who thrived on her subjugation. When he asked if her new partner was good to her, she didn't flinch. She told him this new man saw her true self, not a projected fantasy. Victor played the wounded martyr, wishing her well, a classic manipulation tactic designed to induce guilt. But as she watched his car drive away from her apartment window, the anticipated grief never arrived. The Stockholm Syndrome was dissolving. Only profound relief remained. The life lesson here is simple. Closure isn't an apology. Closure is the total absence of longing. Right on cue, the psychological counterweight entered the narrative. Her phone rang, displaying Adrian's name. She told him his timing was perfect, a stark contrast to the hyper-vigilant state she maintained with Victor. Adrian offered to come over, to cook, to simply exist together. No grand manipulative gestures, just a safe, baseline interaction. As she prepared dinner in her small apartment, she hummed. This environment was nothing like the narcissist's gilded cage. This mismatched furniture was entirely her choice. She was actively rebuilding her autonomous identity. When Adrian arrived an hour later with wine and flowers, it was an exchange between equals, not a transaction of power. It teaches us that true safety is found in the mundane, not the magnificent. The flowers he brought were daisies, simple, unpretentious, and clinically significant. Victor, driving his megalomaniac narcissist agenda, used to send elaborate arrangements meant to dominate a room. Adrian's days demanded nothing. They ate pasta at a cramped table, their knees casually brushing. It was here Adrian introduced his new photography project, a study on human transmission. He wanted to document individuals who had reinvented themselves, and he identified Elena as his primary subject. She had migrated from the shadow of a psychological predator into her own autonomous light. She questioned her worthiness for such a study, a lingering symptom of her previous erasure. We often fail to see our own profound strength until someone else gently frames it for us. Adrian looked across that small table and declared her the most fascinating person he knew. He wanted to chronicle her psychological metamorphosis. For a survivor of severe narcissistic abuse,
allowing someone to document your healing triggers intense vulnerability. As the Stockholm Syndrome conditioning dictates that you remain hidden. Yet, Elena leaned into the discomfort.
She agreed to the project. Well, after a moment of hesitation anyway, as the evening progressed, her internal walls collapsed. She verbalized repressed childhood memories and abandoned ambitions. She articulated a vital developmental milestone, the desire to matter as an individual rather than an extension of a dominant partner. True healing begins the exact moment you decide its existence is inherently valuable. Let us examine the paradox of sudden freedom together. Elena had the financial resources to do basically anything: return to education, launch a non-profit, rebuild from the ground up. For someone escaping a highly controlled environment, this absolute autonomy is deeply terrifying. Adrian offered a clinically sound grounding technique. He told her to start small, to test the waters without demanding immediate perfection. Later, as they migrated to the couch, she rested her head against him. Her nervous system, once perpetually dysregulated by Victor's chaotic demands, was finally calm. In this regulated state, she confessed something monumental. She told Adrian she was falling in love with him. Not trauma-bonded dependence, but actual secure love. Real affection grows in quiet spaces. She gave him permission to withhold a response, anticipating the rejection typical of her past. But Adrian revealed he had been in love with her for months. He pinpointed the exact catalyst, the moment she threw a wine glass at a window. To a behavioral analyst, that act of honest rage signified the shattering of her compliant shell. She was no longer suppressing her reality to appease a megalomaniac narcissist. Adrian admired her capacity to break rather than pretend. He had deliberately withheld his confession to avoid pressuring her fragile recovery, a stark deviation from the suffocating love bombing she was accustomed to. She kissed him with profound certainty. The lesson is clear. Someone who truly values you will always prioritize your healing over their desires. They negotiated their future with remarkable clinical clarity. No grandiose promises, no coercive contracts binding them together. Just a mutual agreement to move forward, choosing each other daily through honest actions. Fast forward 6 months and we observe Elena in a fundamentally altered state. She was standing on the deck of a modest sailboat she had purchased, the city skyline shrinking behind her. Adrian was in the cockpit, his camera capturing her behavioral baseline. When he noted how happy she looked, she confirmed it with absolute conviction. This was not the performed aspirational joy demanded by her former captor. This was authentic regulation. Reclaiming your identity requires steering through turbulent waters, but the destination is a life that is entirely your own. Elena engaged in a psychological defense mechanism known as sublimation, channeling her trauma into constructive action. She began volunteering at a legal aid clinic. She weaponized her intimate knowledge of a megalomaniac narcissist tactics to help vulnerable individuals escape oppressive systems. She was teaching them to identify their legal rights and intrinsic worth. Simultaneously, Adrian completed his photographic study. The images he produced of Elena, sailing, cooking, existing, were revolutionary in their normalcy. There was no hypervigilant posturing, no scanning the room for threats. She was entirely present in her own skin. It leaves us with a profound truth. Our deepest wounds, once examined and understood, often become our most effective tools for helping others. When reviewing the portraits, Elena credited Adrian with making her look a brave. His therapeutic response was to simply state he was documenting what already existed. She had possessed this resilience all along, buried under layers of psychological suppression. As she stood on the boat embracing the uncertain future, her phone vibrated. A message from Marcus. Victor, the megalomaniac narcissist, had acquired a new target, someone from his own elite sphere. For a behavioral analyst, the patient's reaction to this stimulus is the ultimate diagnostic test. Elena experienced absolute emotional flatlining, no jealousy, no lingering elements of Stockholm Syndrome, no desire for vindication, a profound apathy. True detachment is not characterized by hatred, but by total, unwavering indifference. She typed a neutral response, wishing him well and confirming her own contentment. Putting the device away, she observed Adrian, immersed in his camera equipment. You and I must recognize the architecture of this dynamic. This was a secure attachment. Two autonomous individuals choosing to share an orbit, rather than two fractured entities attempting to consume one another to feel whole. She asked to stay out on the water a while longer, watching the sunset paint the sky in burnt oranges. Navigating the vessel back to the marina, she clinically reviewed her past iterations. The naive girl of 27, the shattered woman signing divorce papers. The reality of human growth is stark. We must shed our obsolete skins to make room for the person we are genuinely meant to become. Every previous version of Ter's health had served a necessary evolutionary purpose. We often mislabel the collapse of a toxic structure as a personal failure. In truth, that megalomaniac narcissist had unwittingly performed a vital service. He had obliterated a version of Elena that was deeply susceptible to subjugation. The acute symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome were painful, sure, but necessary for a total system reboot. Later that evening, they engaged in parallel play. She studied legal files while Adrian prepared a meal, two secure adults coexisting without the need for constant validation. Then a new variable was introduced. Adrian announced he had been offered a major gallery exhibition in New York. True growth always demands that we face new, unpredictable tests of our stability. Adrian exhibited a momentary hesitation, a fear of disrupting their stable dynamic. He worried that leaving for several weeks to establish the show might fracture their bond. Elena's intervention was immediate yet and surgically precise. She instructed him to accept the exhibition, assuring him her presence would remain constant upon his return. In a trauma-bonded relationship, independence perceived as a lethal threat. Here, Elena openly declared that their external lives were the very foundation of their functional partnership. He was visibly relieved by her emotional object constancy. She even proposed traveling to New York to witness him in his professional element. A healthy partnership thrives on mutual elevation, never on the suppression of one another's expanding potential. Let's pause and analyze this crucial cognitive shift. Elena recognized that this reciprocal celebrations was entirely absent during her captivity. The megalomaniac narcissist views any achievement outside his control as a direct attack on his ego. Adrian, however, sought to support her without absorbing her identity. Lying in the quiet dark that night, listening to the steady rhythm of Adrian's breathing, Elena confronted the unpredictable variables of the future. For the first time since escaping the grip of Stockholm Syndrome, the unknown did not trigger a panic response. She had synthesized the core data of her trauma. You cannot construct a state tube upon your borrowed ground. You must forge your own internal architecture before you invite anyone else inside. Victor served as the brutal catalyst for identifying what she could never tolerate again. Adrienne acted as the secure baseline, facilitating her authentic desires. But the ultimate psychiatric breakthroughs glowing horizontal belonged entirely to Eladoldi. She had dismantled the core illusion of Stockholm Syndrome, but Sohom started to require an external entity value to validate her existence. She was a complete organism on her own. Every connection was merely an addition, not a necessity. 3 months later, she stood in a New York gallery examining the visual proof of her recovery. She was surrounded by portraits of individuals who had reconstructed their shattered realities. Adrienne approached for her assessment of her own laughing portrait. True liberation is looking at yourself and recognizing the face staring back. Let us open the file on Elena. She stands in the gallery, watching civilians dissect her psychological autopsy. Adrienne, her stabilizing agent, notices her vulnerability. "You okay with people buying these?" he asks. "I can pull them if you're not comfortable." But Elena refuses to retreat. "No, let them buy them," she says. "Maybe it'll remind someone that endings aren't permanent, that you can start over even when it feels impossible." Her clinical objective has shifted. She wants them to understand that surviving a megalomaniac narcissist does not mandate permanent psychological death. The simple truth here is that you can always rebuild your identity from absolute zero, even when your entire foundation feels irreparably shattered by someone else's control.
In psychiatric terms, of healing from abuse is never a linear trajectory. Elena continues articulating this to the crowd. "I want them to know that you don't have to stay broken,"
she explains. That healing isn't linear or pretty or easy, but it's worth it. Adrienne smiles, validating her new reality. "That's beautiful. You made it beautiful. You showed the truth of it," he tells her. The gallery exhibition proves successful, validating her cognitive restructuring. On their final night in New York, Adrienne takes her to an elevated bar above the city. Having your reality dismantled forces a brutal reset, but the profound realization she gains is that brutal honesty accelerates healing far more effectively than living in a beautiful denial ever could. You and I have seen this specific trauma response in countless case studies. As the city lights illuminate the darkness, her nervous system interprets peace as a threat. "What are you thinking?" Adrienne asks. "That I'm happy, really genuinely happy, and that scares me because I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she admits. "Nothing's going to go wrong," he says. "You can't promise that," she replies. He turns to face her, dropping the false assurances. "You're right, I can't, but I can promise I'll be here when things do go wrong. I'll show up even when it's hard." Tears prick her eyes. "That's all I need." The most vital lesson we learn here is that healthy love does not promise an absence of pain, but rather a steadfast, predictable presence when it arrives. We must understand that long-term recovery is not a fairy tale. It is a conscious, daily behavioral choice to reject familiar chaos. Back in her own environment, Elena begins establishing new neural pathways. She pursues academic credentials in social work, expands her advocacy at the legal clinic, and sails to reclaim her bodily autonomy. She meticulously constructs a support network entirely independent of Victor's pervasive influence. Approximately 12 months post-separation, the legal machinery finalizes the dissolution of her trauma bond. A message arrives from Victor's lawyer confirming the paperwork is officially settled. Their marriage is reduced to archival signatures. Sometimes the most empowering human truth is simpler is in closing a file and walking completely away. A fascinating shift occurs in her emotional baseline here. Upon receiving the final documentation, Elena registers neither paralyzing grief nor defensive rage. That evening, they return to the cafe where their stabilizing dynamic was first established. "You seem quiet," Adrian observes. "Just thinking," she says. "The divorce is officially final. All the paperwork's done." He looks at her carefully. How do you feel?" She smirks. Lycan finally stops looking backward and just exists in the present. He nods. "That sounds healthy." She takes his hand. "It feels healthy. Thank you for being patient while I figured this out." True closure is rarely a dramatic climax. The invaluable insight observes that it is just a quiet realization that the past is finally over. Sitting across from her secure attachment figure, she attempts to quantify her gratitude. "You don't have to thank me for that," Adrian tells her. "I do, though," she insists. "You could have walked away 100 times. Most people would have, but you stayed because you were worth staying for." He accepts her disorganized state as evidence of authenticity. "Even when I was a mess, especially when you were a mess," he says. "Messy people are honest people, and I'll take honest over perfect any day." They walk through the city, acknowledging that future behavioral triggers and conflicts are statistically inevitable. The core human takeaway here is crucial. Authentic love is not the absence of pathology, but the mutual decision to remain in the room during the struggle. For 7 years, the subject had functioned purely as an extension of an apex predator. She had molded her entire personality to regulate Victor, his insatiable narcissistic demands. When that pathological ecosystem collapsed, she naturally perceived it as terminal ego's death, but our case file shows it was merely the commencement of her individuation. Victor had provided a suffocating empire built on psychological control, whereas Adrian simply provided the environmental space necessary for her to exist without performing. Examining the trajectory, every phase of her grief was clinically necessary. The beautiful reality we find is that betrayal and severe trauma can act as a surgical scalpel, cutting away artificial adaptations and leaving only the most authentic human identity. Let us look closely at the subject now. She is no longer the compliant hostage who systematically erased herself to manage a volatile captor. She has evolved into an entirely distinct psychological entity, walking through the very jurisdiction she once occupied with Vict. She arrives at a crucial cognitive breakthrough. A megalomaniac narcissist cannot destroy a truly integrated personality. They merely exploit the developmental fractures that were already present in the victim. The agonizing destruction of her marriage simply forced her excavate her foundation down to the bedrock of truth, than the quicksand of a trauma bond. The essential life lesson to internalize is that knowing your own worth is the absolute best defense against those who seek to consume you. In concluding this case file, we observe a complete systemic recovery. Elena has successfully transitioned from the chaotic, high-stakes emotional dependency of a hostage to a stable, reciprocal attachment based on radical honesty. She's no longer a passive object in a narcissist's grand delusion, but the active architect of her own behavioral outcomes. She embraces the profound uncertainty of genuine human connection, definitively rejecting the heavily orchestrated, manufactured intensity she once confused with love. The ultimate takeaway from this psychiatric evaluation is beautifully simple. An authentic life is inherently messy, inherently unpredictable, and utterly real. And for anyone recovering from the darkness of emotional captivity, that messy reality is the only valid cure for me. This story is a meaningful lesson about betrayal, self-worth, healing, and the painful but powerful process of rebuilding life after being discarded. Elena spent 7 years beside Victor Hale, helping him build his empire, supporting his decisions, protecting his secrets, and standing as the silent partner behind his power. But on their anniversary, instead of gratitude or love, Victor gives her a divorce and reveals that he has chosen another woman. That moment is cruel, but it also becomes the beginning of Elena's awakening. The first lesson is that loyalty should never mean self-erasure. Elena gave so much of herself to Victor that she slowly disappeared from her own life. She stopped asking questions, stopped expressing,
pushed out of the partnership that they once shared. Many people stay in relationships where they're but emotionally invisible.
This story reminds us that love should not require a person to become smaller. Another important lesson is about being replaced. Victor believes he can move forward with someone younger and easier, someone who does not carry the history, pain, or truth of their marriage. But what he fails to understand is that a person cannot simply replace depth with novelty. Elena was not just his wife. She was part of the foundation of his success. By discarding her, he does not become free. He reveals his inability to value what truly mattered. Elena's grief is also important. She does not become strong, breaks stars lost, and questions who shares what Victor begins it. Difficult relationship. Adrian's role teaches a different kind of lesson. Unlike Victor, he does not demand, control, or define Elena. He listens. He treats her like a person, not a possession or a problem to solve. Through simple conversations, coffee, photography, and quiet companionship, Elena begins to remember that she exists outside of Victor's world. This shows that healing often comes not from grand gestures, but from being seen, heard, and respected. The story also teaches that closure does not always come from the person who hurt us. When Victor later realizes his mistake, sometimes destroyed. Sometimes the already grown beyond the version of ourselves that needed it.
For viewers, the deepest message is this. Wait for someone else to recognize your worth before Elena's freedom starts when she stops trying to be chosen by Victor and begins choosing herself. Betrayal may break a life apart for the parts of you that were buried for too long.
In the end, Elena's story teaches that losing someone who no longer values you is not the end, that sometimes it is the first honest beginning.